The moment the private agreement landed on the table, everything changed. Not next week, not next month, right then. Because for years, people had whispered that the prince would never go back. They said the bridges were burned, the doors were locked, and the chapter was finished forever. Yet behind the walls of a sprawling California mansion, behind carefully curated photographs and perfectly timed public appearances, a different story was beginning to unfold. A story nobody saw coming. The prince had spent years convincing himself that he had moved on. New country, new life, new identity, new future. That was the plan. That was always the plan. At least that was what everyone was told. But some plans have a habit of collapsing under the weight of reality. And reality had started knocking louder than ever. It began with a phone call, then another, then a series of quiet conversations that never appeared in headlines. The kind of conversations that make a person stare at the ceiling long after midnight. The kind that force someone to ask a question they have spent years avoiding. What if leaving was easier than staying away? That question lingered day after day, week after week, until eventually it became impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, tensions were rising, not because of one argument, not because of one disagreement, because of 1,000 tiny cracks forming at the same time. A missed conversation here, an uncomfortable silence there, a decision postponed, a promise delayed, the kind of things that seem small individually but become impossible to ignore when stacked together. Friends noticed it, advisors noticed it, even staff members reportedly sensed that something felt different. The atmosphere had changed, and when an atmosphere changes, people start talking. Rumors began swirling that the prince had quietly started exploring a temporary return to Britain. Nothing permanent, nothing dramatic, just 1 year, one carefully structured year, a trial period, a chance to reconnect with the parts of his life that had been left behind. At first, it sounded impossible. Then it sounded unlikely. Then suddenly it sounded very real. The proposal was simple. Split time, reconnect with family, rebuild damaged relationships, attend key events, slowly restore trust, no grand announcement, no dramatic comeback speech, just a gradual return. But there was one enormous problem. The Duchess hated the idea, absolutely hated it, because from her perspective, the proposal represented something much bigger than geography. It represented direction, the future, control, identity, everything. And when she realized the discussions were becoming serious, insiders claimed the atmosphere behind closed doors became explosive. Not loud at first. The most dangerous arguments rarely start loudly. They start quietly. A sharp comment over dinner, a tense glance across a room, a conversation that suddenly stops when someone walks in. The temperature rises degree by degree until eventually nobody remembers exactly where the fire began. The prince argued that a year was not forever. The Duchess reportedly saw it differently. A year could become two, two could become three, and before long the entire life they had built could begin shifting back toward the very institution they had once left behind. That fear changed everything, because this was no longer about travel schedules. This was about loyalty, vision, future, and the deeper those conversations went, the harder they became. Meanwhile, whispers from Britain only intensified. Every new rumor seemed to add fuel to the fire. Every reported conversation became another source of tension. Every mention of family reconciliation created new questions. Questions nobody seemed able to answer. Was the prince homesick? Was he feeling regret? Was he trying to repair old relationships? Or was something even bigger happening behind the scenes? Nobody knew. But one thing was becoming impossible to ignore. His focus was changing. The man who once seemed determined to keep moving forward had started looking backward, toward old memories, old friendships, old responsibilities, and perhaps most importantly, old family bonds. That shift did not happen overnight, but once it started, it accelerated quickly. And the more determined he became, the more emotional the situation grew inside the household, because now every discussion carried enormous consequences. Every decision felt final. Every disagreement felt personal. Then came the meeting that reportedly changed everything. The meeting that left insiders stunned. The meeting where the prince allegedly accepted the framework for a 1-year return plan. Not a rumor anymore, not a possibility, a plan. And when word of that decision reached the Duchess, those close to the situation claimed the reaction was immediate, emotional, intense, and impossible to contain. Because suddenly the future she thought was certain no longer looked certain at all. And if the first half of this story was about whispers, the second half was about consequences. Because once the decision was made, there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. The countdown had officially begun. And nobody, not the prince, not the Duchess, not Not even those closest to them was prepared for what happened next. The days that followed felt less like a family discussion and more like a countdown toward an unavoidable collision. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same issue. Every attempt to change the subject eventually returned to the one-year return plan. It hung over the household like a storm cloud that refused to move. The prince appeared more determined than ever. For the first time in years, he was not speaking about what he had left behind. He was speaking about what he feared losing forever. Childhood memories, family connections, relationships damaged by distance and silence. The more he thought about them, the harder it became to push them aside. Meanwhile, the Duchess found herself facing a reality she had never expected. She had spent years building a life that was supposed to represent a fresh beginning, a new chapter, a complete separation from the pressures and expectations that once dominated their lives. Now that foundation suddenly felt unstable. Every rumor coming from Britain seemed to point toward one thing: the prince was changing, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. What made the situation even more dramatic was the reaction from both sides of the Atlantic. Supporters argued that reconnecting with family was the natural next step. Critics claimed the move exposed regrets that had been hidden for years. Commentators speculated endlessly. Friends reportedly picked sides. Even casual observers sensed that something significant was unfolding beneath the surface. Then came another unexpected twist. The prince reportedly began discussing future projects that would require more time in Britain than anyone originally anticipated. What was supposed to be a limited arrangement suddenly appeared capable of expanding. Not officially, not publicly, but the possibility was there. And possibilities can be more frightening than realities because they leave room for imagination to do its worst. The Duchess reportedly viewed every new development as another sign that the ground beneath her feet was shifting. What started as 1 year now looked like the beginning of something larger. Every private reassurance seemed less convincing than the last. Every promise carried uncertainty. Every plan contained questions nobody could answer. The emotional pressure reached a point where even ordinary moments became difficult. Family dinners reportedly turned tense. Long silences became more frequent. Discussions that began calmly often ended with neither side satisfied. The issue was no longer whether the prince would spend time in Britain. That battle had effectively ended. The real battle was about what happened after the year was over, and that question terrified everyone involved. Because what if the return reignited old loyalties? What if damaged relationships started healing? What if the distance that once felt necessary suddenly felt unbearable? Those questions lingered in the background of every conversation. At the same time, the prince appeared increasingly focused on repairing bridges that many people believed were permanently destroyed. He seemed convinced that some opportunities would not exist forever. Time was moving forward. Circumstances were changing. And waiting another 5 years might mean missing chances that could never be recovered. That sense of urgency drove him forward. The Duchess, however, reportedly saw the situation through a completely different lens. To her, every step toward Britain represented a step away from the future they had built together. Every compromise felt like a concession. Every agreement felt temporary. The result was an emotional stalemate that neither side seemed capable of resolving. Yet despite all the tension, despite all the frustration, despite all the rumors swirling around them, the return plan continued moving forward. Meetings were discussed. Timelines were considered. Arrangements slowly took shape behind the scenes. And that is when people closest to the situation reportedly realized something remarkable. The argument was no longer about whether the prince would return. That decision had already been made. The real story had become what the return would change. Because once someone walks back through a door they spent years trying to leave behind, they rarely come out unchanged. Old memories return. Old relationships awaken. Old loyalties reappear. And sometimes those forces become stronger than anyone expected. As the departure date moved closer, the atmosphere grew even more intense. Questions multiplied. Speculation exploded. Emotions ran higher than ever. Nobody knew exactly how the story would end, but everyone sensed the same thing. The one-year plan was never just about 1 year. It was the beginning of a much larger chapter. And the moment that chapter officially began, nothing in their world would ever look quite the same again.